So it's almost 4th of July. We're in DC, and I'm talking to you guys about the government, which is probably one of the most stereotypical things you could talk about here. I'm going to talk about and try to walk this really narrow line by trying to talk about what is broken about the government, but also try to give you guys a little bit of hope about some of the possibilities for things to be fixed. So as Joel mentioned, my name is Kavi Harshawat. I'm an interaction designer and user researcher. I work at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I lead a small team of engineers, product designers, and product managers there. I'm from here. As you might expect, I'm in tech. I've lived in San Francisco for a little bit more than 7 years now. And I've worked at a lot of small startups, a small company called Google, an organization called Code for America, which is a nonprofit organization. And about a year ago, I moved out here to DC to join a bunch of crazy, awesome nerds to work on something called the United States Digital Service. Before I get to explaining exactly what that is, I want to give you a sense of the types of problems that we work on. So as I mentioned, I work at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I want you to think for a second about a veteran who has done service for this country. Often veterans come back with injuries such as traumatic brain disorders or lost limbs. And when that happens, the veteran's entitled to what's known as a veteran benefit claim. Today, it takes more than 137 days to process those claims. Obviously, this is a huge problem if you are struggling with a debilitating illness or injury caused by your time in service. Worse yet, it takes more than 1,000 different websites and more than 900 different call-in numbers for someone to navigate and understand how to apply for that process. This is completely unheard of and ridiculous. To navigate those websites is a maze. A lot of these websites are inconsistent or out of date and completely unhelpful. This is a snapshot of the different types of buttons that you see across federal government websites today. Obviously not a lot of consistency here. The internal tools used in the government are also not much better, the tools that are used to process these benefit claims. This is actually a screenshot from a tool that I'm replacing right now, and it's got what I like to call the Windows 95 design aesthetic. It's lots of colorful tabs, many checkboxes and text boxes, but obviously it wasn't really designed at all, right? Especially to complete and make the process of filing a claim and processing it much more efficient. We see these types of problems all over the government. Every year, millions of people apply to immigrate into the United States. And the system is mostly paper-based, much like the other systems that we see across the country. The time that it takes to process these claims or these immigration requests is very, very long. It can take at times 6 months and cost $400. And if you're coming from very little financial means trying to immigrate into that country, that can be a huge burden. This, I'm sure you guys have heard about before. Over the last couple of years, it's become really, really obvious that websites like healthcare.gov are not the exception, but are the norm, right? There are so many services that are supposed to be useful for the citizens of this country that just don't do their job right. There are so many outdated systems that don't work the way that they intend to. The government spends $86 billion in federal IT funding every single year. That's more than the entire venture capital industry spends annually. 94% of these projects are over budget or behind schedule, and 40% of them are never even shipped. They never see the light of day. Obviously, something is significantly broken about the way that the government delivers its services to its citizens. Honestly, it's been a very frustrating and challenging experience working in this government, but complaining about it doesn't really do anyone any good. It's not going to help the hundreds of thousands of homeless in this country. It's not going to help the millions of veterans or immigrants. It's not going to help the hundreds of millions of people who just live here every day. This is why the United States Digital Service was created. USDS is a startup inside the federal government that's working to bring design and technology to deliver better services to the services that citizens use every day. It's made up of product managers, engineers, designers, tech nerds, policy wonks, everyone you could possibly imagine, both from in DC and also all over the country. People who've put their lives on hold to come here to do this type of work. What we're trying to do is create a tradition of public service in the tech industry, much like you see in the Peace Corps or in Teach for America. People come in for tours of duty of 6 months, a year, 2 years, and often what we end up seeing is people who come for shorter stints, like 6 months, go back to their jobs, realize that it's not fulfilling as working here, and come back for even longer. We're all driven towards the same goal, which is to build a more awesome government for the people and by the people. And we've already made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. We have agencies all over, we have teams in agencies all over the federal government, in the Department of State, Homeland Security, where I work at the VA, the Department of Defense, and many more. I have been working in the VA for about a year now, and I've seen the ways firsthand that the government is broken. But I've also, as a designer, learned to empathize a lot with the struggles that the government sees day in and day out. It tells you a lot about the work that's going on, and that has been going on for decades and for centuries since our government has existed. What I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about some of those anecdotes, some of the stories through the lens of USDS and our values. These are actually our values. I'll read them out because it's a little bit hard to see. Hire and empower great people, go to where the work is, find the truth and tell the truth, optimize for results and not optics, design with users, not for them, and create momentum. So I'm going to start off with talking about hiring and empowering great people. And anyone who's tried to hire good people knows how difficult that can be, period. It's hard to find people who are self-motivated or driven, and the types of people that work best in USDS can handle a huge amount of ambiguity. They build relationships with people in these organizations, both at the senior level and on the ground, and they're also driven and experts in their respective fields. It turns out that it's actually pretty hard to hire people from companies with weird names across the country who've never had a background in government before. And it took us more than a year to hire our first teammate at the VA. And that was only after the deputy secretary, one of the most senior officials in the entire VA, sat down with the HR folks and didn't let them leave until they figured out a strategy forward. Today, we're actually doing pretty well. There are 162 team members at USDS across the board, more than 50% of whom are women. And I'm also very happy about the fact that more than 30% of them are people of color, as a person of color. And it's not just good enough to have people brought in from the outside. There's also many people who work in the government who do an amazing job and have worked here for a long period of time. We like to think of ourselves as working shoulder to shoulder with people in the government, these civil servants. But one of the things that's really important to recognize is that not everybody meets that criteria. I like to categorize people we interact with in the government in kind of two ways. When you ask them a question and ask them if you can do something, one group will say no. That's against the rules, that's not allowed. And then the other group will say, yes, I'm not sure how we can do it, but let's try to figure it out together. That latter group is the ones that we want to work with most closely in USDS, and there are many of them. They're just a little bit hard to find. And the reason for that is that the government normally doesn't empower those types of people. Usually you're trying to follow the rules as closely as possible, not trying to break the rules and try to come up with new ways and new solutions for solving these types of problems. We are also pretty humble in the fact that we need to recognize we're not the first people to try and do this stuff, to first people to try to bring technology to come to bear on these problems. My favorite example of this is actually in the Department of Veterans Affairs. There's a group of people called the Hard Hats. They were around in the 1970s, and basically they were computer hobbyists. They had spent their time tinkering with computers in their free time, and they said, hey, why don't we use these computers, these new devices, to serve veterans better. They paired with doctors and pharmacists and many other types of people to basically make software that served veterans better. And they got a lot of pushback. Much like we do today, there were people who were very antagonistic with them. People who would literally go and pour coffee on their mainframes just to spite them. The organization itself also wasn't set up to handle this type of work, right? People weren't aware of what could be possible with the technology, and so they were afraid of it. But they persevered, they broke through wall after wall after wall, which is how they actually got their name, the Hard Hats. They created a underground railroad of software where that eventually led to the creation of the VA's healthcare system, of the electronic healthcare system. And if you guys, any of you are in the healthcare industry today, this was actually used as the base for Epic, which is a pretty popular one that's used more across the country. So again, we try to find people who've had this experience, who try to plow through walls and barriers and who work really, really hard. So the next one is go to where the work is. It probably doesn't come as a surprise to any of you that a lot of the work that we do, especially when it comes to modern development practices and design, not everybody's willing or ready to handle that. When we joined the VA, we were tasked with working on this claims backlog problem. And obviously, there was a huge amount of focus on it from the media and from Congress and from the public. People wanted it fixed as quickly as possible. For us to come in and try to fix that problem ourselves without any of that context was not seen as a huge value to the organization. They'd already put huge amounts of financial resources and people hours behind the problem. At best, we would have impacted the project in a very little way by putting lots and lots of effort into it. And at worst, we would have derailed the entire thing and undone all of the efforts that they had gone through. So we took a step back and we realized maybe this is not the best place for us to be working right now. We want to work on a problem that is similar to this and that meets the same needs, but it's going to help and is a better use of our time. So we ended up working and shifting our focus on the appeals part of the process instead, where when a veteran actually applies for a benefit and they don't get the outcome that they want, they can appeal it. All right, our engagements with agencies are kind of defined by a few different criteria that we really we find to be very helpful. This is kind of what defines a really successful engagement. Hard deadlines, so making sure that the project doesn't drag on forever, and this is especially important in the government where it can take 2 or 3 years to gather requirements about a project, let alone write a line of code or create a single mock. Also, having a sense of urgency from the stakeholders on the ground, especially employees, is incredibly important, right? Because if they don't feel like something is a problem, then they're not going to do their work to help support you. Also, air cover and support from senior leadership across the organization. So I mentioned the deputy secretary earlier. I also mentioned the secretary. Those from them and also up onto the president, we have that kind of support in USDS. And so this is actually what makes a lot of this stuff possible, especially as we're pushing back against a lot of the norms that you see in the government. And finally, and one of my most favorite ones is having a target audience, a group of users that you're designing your software for. Because if you're just building software for the sake of it, it's probably not going to be very useful. The next one is a favorite of ours in USDS. It's find the truth and tell the truth. It is shocking how rarely real data is used to drive decisions in the government. It's true. So obviously when teams don't have data to work on, they're working under false assumptions, and that's a big hindrance. Our teams believe in radical transparency, trying to communicate as much as possible what's going on, what the problems are, and how to solve them. It's a really delicate line because you don't want to just be kind of harping on the bad and the negative all the time. You need to be able to be identifying solutions as well. And we try to do so in a really respectful way. The government is afraid of a bad news story. I'm sure you've all seen this before, but Congress or the media attacking a project can mean the difference between getting funded for another couple of years and having the project shut down entirely. And as a result, entire groups try as hard as possible to hide as much information. Not explicitly, but they're just afraid of it, right? There's no incentive to communicating in the public. Even when a project like ours has some level of success, there's anxiety about talking about it, because in order to do so, you need to address and set up the problem itself. This is a really big problem that we have all the time, but it's also not serving anyone. Often, the problems grow out of control and become bigger than they need to be just because no one's talking about them. And also, the problems that are the most important, often ones that have no visibility to the public, the systems that I talked about earlier that nobody gets to see. People need to start communicating a lot better about this, and this is why we're trying to bring this value into the government. This is Richard Feynman. He is a scientist, quite famous, and he among many of his other accomplishments, he was involved in a commission in the mid-'80s to investigate the space shuttle disaster that was the Challenger disaster. Feynman actually went to NASA and talked to people at all levels, people who were working on the ground as employees, people in senior leadership, and what he realized was that people knew about the problem of the space shuttle disaster before it even happened. The information wasn't communicated effectively to people at the top or throughout. There was a hesitance to share that information because they didn't want to derail all the efforts that they had made in order to make the project a success. And this is what happened, a disaster. Feynman fought with the commission to have an unfiltered account of exactly what he'd found in NASA. And the commission pushed back. They said, no, we need to make it a little bit lighter. We don't want the public to get dismayed by what's happened here. And he fought and fought and fought, and eventually they came up with a compromise. He created an appendix at the end of this report that laid out all the facts. They thought no one would read it. They were wrong. Many people read it. And at the end of this report, at the very last line of this appendix, he wrote the following. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. There is no way for the government to do good work and improve the problems if they don't know about them or they don't address them to each other, let alone to the public. This is why this value is so important to us. The next one is optimizing for results and not optics. So as I mentioned before, the example that I gave was the working at the VA on the claims backlog. And again, there was so much pressure from the public to work on this problem. But honestly, like I said, we could put in a huge amount of effort and not have any progress to work on that, not to show for it. The government is very reactive, as I'm sure you know. They jump from fire to fire on the most visible types of problems. But what they don't realize, and what we probably don't realize all that often, is that this creates kind of like a boiling frog syndrome, right? If all you're working on is emergencies and that's the norm, then you're not worrying about the problems that are actually causing these problems, right? The problems, the emergencies, those are symptoms, they're not the root cause. The real problems are the stuff that nobody sees on a day-to-day basis. And so if you're optimizing for metrics, you're probably not going to focus on those types of problems. At USDS, we kind of have a lot of different criteria. We talk about what to work on. We obviously get a lot of insight from what Congress recommends, what the White House recommends, what our agencies and the stakeholders we work with recommend. But honestly, it kind of comes down to something like this. What will do the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the greatest need? We didn't have to work on the appeals process. We could have worked on another project entirely. But not every problem has the visibility of healthcare.gov. The stuff we work on at USDS is inherently unsexy, right? We're not working on self-driving cars. We're not building spaceships to Mars as much as we would like to. We're just bringing the same boring stuff that we see every single day in the tech industry here into the government. The bar is really, really low. It's true. Like I said, a lot of the stuff that we work on is outdated systems, building simple websites, a lot of paperwork, honestly, setting up contracts and things like that. But this is the stuff that matters, right? This is the stuff that makes the biggest difference for citizens at the end of the day. It's not the big flashy, we're going to create a website or we're going to create a new initiative or policy initiative or something like that. It's this stuff. This one is one of my favorites. I hope it's probably one of your favorites. Design with users, not for them. This is another area where the bar is incredibly low. I'll tell you how the government builds software. They build software like they buy a table. You go and you order a couple table legs, you order a tabletop, you order a fresh coat of paint, and then one day all that stuff arrives at your front step and you put it together and it's done. That's not how software works. Software requires iteration. It requires people's feedback and to continue working on it over and over and over again, right? This doesn't happen in the government that often. Again, there are exceptions. People are trying to do this, but this is not the norm. I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite stories. This is our team, and we went up to New York regional office at the VA to test out one of the products we were working on. There we met Elizabeth. She's on the right here, and she's adorable. She's amazing, but she's also been working at the VA for 20 years. Before we got to work, she sat down and she told us two things. First, I love vehicles. This thing. She loves it. She's been using it for the last 20 years. It's known to her. She loves everything about it. She knows that it's going to be reliable and steady state all the time. The second thing she told us is that she hates change. It's not hard to understand why this is, right? If you're not getting feedback from people regularly, every time you see a change, it's probably not going to be the thing that's in the best interest of these employees, these civil servants who are doing the work on the ground. So we sat down with her, we got her feedback. 2 days later, we had shown her the changes that we'd made, and she was shocked. She had no idea that someone could turn around changes that quickly, right? Just communicating, just asking the person what their thoughts are on the software that they're using, whether it be a citizen or an internal employee at the VA, it makes a huge difference, right? This is why we have this as a value. We talk to users whenever possible. We do user research with everyone, whether it means grabbing people on the street, on the mall who are on a field trip, or actually setting up research studies, whether they're here in DC or remote across the country. This is super, super important. And the last one is create momentum. People often ask me, how are you going to maintain the digital service after you guys leave? You're here for 2 years and then you're going to be gone. Well, first of all, we're not. We're going to be here for a lot longer than that. People are going to continue rotating in and out. But also, it's a good question, right? We're inherently transient. And in fact, our best outcome is to put ourselves out of business, right? We don't want to be here if the government is doing its job correctly. I'll give you some information. We have about 6 months of air cover from those senior leaders that I talked about before. The deputy secretary, the president, but also all the senior leaders that are elected officials across the government. There are 250 chief information officers across the federal government, actually probably a little bit more than that. And under them, 82,000 federal IT employees. In our best case scenario today, we are 162 people. We're obviously not going to fix every single problem that we see across the government. People kind of frame us as a fix-it team, but we're not going to fix everything, right? That's not sustainable. So what can we do? We have this strategy, and the strategy is delivering as much value as possible. Remember that 94% that I mentioned earlier of projects that are over budget or behind schedule. The bar is, again, really, really low, but if we are delivering software or improvements to citizen services on a scale of maybe 3 months, which is actually pretty conservative by like tech standards, then we're doing well beyond what the government normally does. And hopefully, some of that rubs off and people start to pay attention to it. And when they pay attention to it, they'll learn and look at what we're doing to make sure that that stuff is getting shipped. They'll learn from the values of human-centered design. They'll learn from the stuff around modern development that we're doing and carry that forward. This is also the value of having people rotate in and out of industry, right? We'll get fresh perspectives from people in industry, get new ideas, and inject that into the government as much as possible. So those are our values. Hire and empower great people, go to where the work is, find the truth, tell the truth, optimize for results and not optics, design with users, not for them, and create momentum. So we've actually accomplished a lot in the last couple of years that we've been here. We launched the United States Web Design Standards, which is hopefully relevant to a lot of you guys. This is basically a set of shared styles that can be used across federal websites in the government. It creates a more unified and consistent web experience for citizens who are engaging, and we're also actually using it for internal tools as well. So over time, hopefully, one day, that this will actually just be the thing that everybody uses, and that every time you interact with a website, it's not going to be those thousands of different buttons that I showed you before, but one consistent experience that you have. We also launched vets.gov. Those thousands of different websites that I mentioned earlier that a veteran has to access and use in order to transact with the VA, we're consolidating those into a single experience that will be used to help veterans apply for healthcare benefits, employee benefits, educational loans, that kind of stuff. And we've actually made a lot of progress on this already. You can go to vets.gov and actually see what it looks like today. We also launched College Scorecard that lets prospective college students find out and compare universities in the country. And with this, we actually opened up a ton of real data that's going to be very valuable. And news organizations have used that data to create their own comparisons and to basically identify what are the big problems in the education industry. It reveals information about tuition, financial aid, graduation rates, and how much salary you might get after you graduate from one of these universities. This is a cool one. We also launched a program called Hack the Pentagon. This is at the Department of Defense, and it's what is known as a bug bounty program in industry. Literally, the Department of Defense let white hat hackers find vulnerabilities in their websites and report them to make them better, to make the security better. This is an idea that would have never been possible a couple of years ago, especially considering the anxiety that the government has around cybersecurity. And the last one that's kind of my favorite is Caseflow. This is actually this product that I work on with my team. And this is actually working to improve the back end, the backstage part of the appeals process at the VA. So this is not an external facing tool, it's internal, but it's actually providing a lot of value that's going to be downstream very, very, very beneficial to veterans. So, what does it all mean? Why does this matter? I'm gonna get up on my soapbox here. The United States was founded on this principle of civic participation, right? The silent influence of government is in everything that we do, whether you recognize it or not. We owe it to each other and ourselves to improve the government that we have because it's the only one we've got. We owe it to the little guy, to our neighbors, and to our friends to work hard to improve the government. It doesn't have to be joining USDS, although that would be awesome. It could be voting, it could be getting more involved in your local politics, it could be knowing and learning more about the problems that you're seeing in the government and having an educated conversation about it. Because without all of us, this government, it doesn't work. This is very tiny, and I'm gonna do a little bit of a taboo here and read text off of this slide because I think it's actually really captures the way that I and a lot of you other USDS people feel about the work what we're doing. This is from George Bernard Shaw, who's an Irish playwright. I'm just going to read it out loud. This is the true joy in life, being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as an almighty one. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle for me. It's a sort of splendid torch which I've got a hold of for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. Thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you so much to Creative Mornings for hosting, and I'm happy to take questions after this. Thanks.